Hello, welcome back to Hazel Jane Tarot. Today I'm bringing you what I hope will be a short book review of the book Faery Wicca Book 1 by Kisma Stepanich. And one of the reasons I've just made this as a separate video is because there's been a certain amount of interest on my channel and through other people in the tarot community that I know in the Faery Wicca Tarot, and I know by extension maybe potentially in this book. So the first thing I wanted to say is that you do not need to read or have this book in order to understand or work with the Faery Wicca Tarot. This book doesn't reference the tarot at all in the book, so you do not need this. It's not a guidebook to the Faery Wicca Tarot. What it is an introductory book into the religion of Faery Wicca. And it takes you through the belief system of Kisma Stepanich's belief system, which underpins the philosophy behind the tarot deck, I guess. But there's enough of that in the little guidebook that comes with the tarot deck. I don't think you need to have read this book at all. So this book has some things about it that I enjoyed, but overall, I think I gave this 2 stars maybe in my journal. And the main reason for that, to be honest, is what the book claims to be. So as you can see here at the top, it says the ancient oral fairy tradition of Ireland. So in the introduction to this book, Kisma Stepanich, who is an American of Irish descent, she claims that the religion of Faery Wicca was founded by the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves, and that this oral tradition was passed down through the millennia, and that she was then initiated into this religion, and that she is then using that information in this book to, invite other people or whatever to join the religion of Faery Wicca. Now, the Tuatha Dé Danann are the ancient mythical figures of Ireland from the ancient Irish myths and legends. So people like the Morrigan, like Bridget, like the Dagda, like Danu, these ancient gods and goddesses of Ireland. And the idea that any unbroken line of an oral tradition could be passed down from them to the present, I find absurd. And, I find this difficult to talk about fairly, because I know Faery Wicca is some people's religion. I mean, that's how it is presented in this book. And these beliefs are obviously very, very, very important to Kisma Stepanich. So I'm not saying that this religion is absurd. The idea of something being an unbroken oral tradition, and then somehow she has managed to have access to that and present this to us, when in 42 years of living and growing up in Ireland, I've never heard of this. I don't know. It's just, I'm not 100% comfortable with this as an idea. And I have no problem with Stepanich as an American researching and presenting a book on Celtic mythology and Celtic religion, because, she's done lots of research. I'm not taken away from that at all. It's just, I feel what we have here is a kind of a personal gnosis, or like her own personal beliefs that she has taken, obviously very passionate, very informed belief in Irish mythology and the ancient figures of Irish myth and so on. And that has been worked into a detailed religious system with beliefs and practices and so on. I mean, that's fine. That's really interesting. And I think I found that really interesting to read about, how Stepanich has been able to go from her beliefs in the Irish, the figures of Irish mythology, like those gods and goddesses, and weave that into like a religious practice. I find that fascinating. I just don't think it's definitive or authoritatively like the only true religion of Ireland. And that's where I sort of had a bit of a sticking point with this book. But in terms of seeing how you can take these beliefs and turn it into like a coherent religious system, I think it is fascinating. So what we have in the book then, so we have an introduction to the Irish, the cycles of Irish mythology. And then there's this interesting section on fairy lineage. This is something I was a wee bit skeptical of. Like, she's tried to tie together all the different fairies of different folklore traditions. Like, so we have the devas, for example. We have things like Victorian flower fairies. We have the Tuatha Dé Danann in there. And she's kind of tried to link this together as sort of one lineage of fairy that is sort of the core belief system of Faery Wicca. For me, these aren't all the same thing, but you know, that's what it is in this book. And then we have sort of some stuff on the Celtic gods and goddesses and their backgrounds. Now, it's not bad information. You can get, I mean, there are lots of excellent books on Celtic gods and goddesses which could be read instead of this. It's just a small part of this book. This bit I found quite interesting about the circles of the year. Let me see if I can find where that begins. Yeah, so she talks about the festivals, or the Celtic festivals. She talks about the wheel of the year. Sorry, I forgot to mention actually, the best thing about this book to me are Renee Christine Yates's illustrations. Now, that's the artist who did the Faery Wicca Tarot as well. I mean, the illustrations are absolutely beautiful, and they suit the black and white incredibly well. I think in the tarot deck with the colouring, the detail that you get here in these black and white images is lost a little bit. So Renee Christine Yates is the artist, and her pictures are fabulous. But so we've got the chapter on the great festivals. I found that really interesting, I guess. Then there's another chapter here on the land of fairy, which was quite interesting. Now, this does bring in Welsh mythology too, and she's a little bit, to my eye, a little bit free and easy of combining sort of Welsh mythology or other like broader European Celtic mythology and Irish traditions, when this is sort of presented as a definitively Irish set of beliefs. Like these are Welsh words here, for example. And I don't know if that's anything to do with Wiccan traditions more broadly and trying to bring that in. But that land of fairy thing about the different circles of existence, and then looking at when we go into Sacred Space, chapter 6, I find this quite interesting as well, where she talks about the 4 provinces of Ireland and the associations of them. Now, this is something I'd never read before, so I don't know if these attributions are traditional or if they're something that she has created. But these, I'm born and raised in Ulster, and I hadn't heard, these sort of associations. But the idea that Ulster is associated with battle, obviously goes back to the Ulster cycle and the mythology, but also, when you think about the modern situation in Northern Ireland and the Troubles and so on, the association of Ulster and battle kind of raised a wry smile, I have to say. But that I found really interesting. Actually, that was maybe one of my favourite parts of the whole book, is the associations for the 4 provinces, and then the centre, the idea of Meath as the centre of Ireland. So that was interesting. But she also goes into about how to create an altar in a lot of detail. So different types of altars. And again, I don't know if this derives from Wicca or if this is something that she has created, but she talks about setting up altars based on the idea of the regions of Ireland and, different sort of balance in masculine and feminine and altar spaces and so on. So just out of interest, as sort of how people can go about having a magical practice, I find that whole bit about creating altars quite interesting. In this chapter about modern Faery Wicca, there is a section on the witch trials of Ireland, which was quite interesting, and based on other reading that I've done, because I've done quite a lot of reading about the history of witch persecutions in Ireland, it is very close to the facts that I had read in other sources. So that section seemed to be pretty well researched, the part on the witch trials. There was very little witch persecution in Ireland if you compare Ireland to the likes of Scotland and other European countries. There were only a few, like just a handful, maybe less than 10 documented cases. And she does give a reasonable overview of them in the chapter of this book. But then the second half, so that's half is sort of all the foundation in terms of beliefs and history and so on. And then the second half of the book is about sort of magical practices. So it goes through everything from journeying, like astral journeying, kind of to find a spiritual benefactor, which would be like a god or goddess from Ireland. And she talks about getting a fairy fetch, like a fairy who will go and do your bidding, kind of to get your spiritual benefactor. That's not something I'm going to do, but it was interesting to read about. The meditations are all written out in a lot of detail. She also goes into like how to create a wand, for example, and there's a lot of detail about finding the branch and what to do with it and how to consecrate it and how to make it into a wand, and it goes into a lot of detail, which again, just as in terms of magical practice, I thought was interesting. There's a section on the meanings of the ogams. Now, I know there is some controversy over whether the tree associations and the sort of divinatory associations with ogams are genuinely old, or if ogam is literally just an alphabet script from ancient times that later writers ascribed these tree meanings to. I have, in reading up a bit on this book, I did find a bit of controversy on that as well, but in terms of there is a lot of detail here, like there's maybe a couple of pages on each, or a page or so on each ogam and what its divinatory kind of or symbolic meaning is, so that was interesting enough to read. And then she goes into like setting up a temple. There's stuff about some Celtic symbols and stuff. But she goes into like how to set up a temple, and it's really prescriptive. Like she is very like exactly like what should be in the space, where it should be in terms of the 4 directions, what should be in each corner, the different altars in each corner. And then she goes into ceremony as well, and like having ceremonies and how to set up a ceremonial space, like how large it should be outdoors and what altars there should be in different places and what actions people should take. And it literally goes into music and poetry and like how to make something to wear to the ceremony and all. It's very, very prescriptive. So it's a very specific prescriptive account of how to practice this religion of Faery Wicca. So what I enjoyed about this book, I think, was the working through of how her belief in the Tuatha Dé Danann has been sort of made practical in terms of a ritualized religious practice. And I think if you were just reading it as a kind of, this is one person's approach to their witchcraft or their pagan beliefs or their Celtic beliefs, and we're getting some ideas out, I could put that on an altar, or I've never thought of using that kind of music in a ritual or something like that. I find it interesting in that way. So to try to, but the things I didn't like about it so much, as I say, I'm cautious of not wanting to disrespect people who practice Faery Wicca or the writer herself and her obviously very strongly held beliefs. But just for me, as an Irish person reading this book, the idea that she calls the priests of her order leprechauns and the priestesses of her order banshees was just, that made me laugh, because Irish people don't really take the idea of leprechauns terribly seriously. Like, we take the idea of fairies quite seriously, like as fairies being something not to mess with, like something to be careful of, but like leprechauns are kind of comical tourist advertising kind of thing. But the idea that she called her priests leprechauns and her priestesses banshees was a bit of a sticking point. She includes a recipe for soda bread here, which is good. And then she has an alternative recipe that includes like caraway seeds and raisins and stuff that you would never get in soda bread in Ireland. But I guess maybe that's for American tastes or something. So it's just things like that, Other reviews that I've read have suggested that there are factual inaccuracies in here in terms of the accounts of some of the myths or the stories around some of the gods and goddesses and so on. I'm not well enough schooled in that to really pick up on those types of inaccuracies. There were some bits that really did jar with me. Like, she talked about the arrival of St. Patrick and the Protestants, which to me was just, maybe she's just misspoke in terms of the words. Like, the arrival of Christianity, yes, but like Protestantism didn't exist at the time that Patrick arrived in Ireland. So saying the arrival of Patrick and the Protestants isn't right. So with the things like that I find jarring, but I think for other people who maybe are more schooled in Irish mythology, there might be other things, and I have read other reviews online that did suggest. I'll maybe try to link some of the reviews I read below, because there was one by Morgan Dalmer, who has written a number of books on Celtic mythology, who was quite scathing about this book, so you can read what they say and see what you think as well. There's, I think one thing that did strike me is that she kind of ignores centuries of caution in Ireland and Irish traditions and Irish folklore about fairies. I mean, there are books and books available of about people's encounters with the fairies, of people getting the stray put on them by the fairies, of people disappearing for periods of time and coming back older, or of changeling childs, of the fairies being kind of dangerous. And now, of course, that could be kind of informed by the arrival of Christianity in Ireland, and there is a bit of an association with, say, witchcraft and the fairies for definite in Irish mythology, or not in mythology, in folklore and in the history, because like when you look at some of the witch trials or people being accused of being a witch in Irish history, whereas in other Protestant countries you might have found witches were accused of being with the devil. In Ireland, a lot of people who were accused of being witches were accused of being in league with the fairies, not the devil, of being in league with the fairies, and of the fairies being the kind of the dangerous, unpredictable thing there that the witches were working with. So, there's that sort of maybe Christian bias against the fairies that is there in the Irish folk traditions, and she was maybe trying to just override that or go around that or whatever. But I think in terms of like encouraging this book, sort of being encouraging people to really invoke and call on and work with the fairies, there is a lack of caution that as an Irish person I just find a wee bit of a concern. Like here we're very people don't cut down the random tree in the middle of the field. They don't level the little circle of stones, because while maybe they don't really believe in fairies, there's you don't want to take any risks. And I think that that element of caution is just not there in this book. There are contradictions in the book as well. Like in one place she talks about how fairies don't eat and they're fed by sunlight, and then in another bit she talks about leaving food out for the fairies, and that's just directly contradictory. So there were contradictions like that in it as well that I had a wee bit of a problem with. But generally, yeah, I think there are, if you want to learn about Celtic mythology and you want to learn about the gods and goddesses of Ireland, or you want to learn about Irish folk beliefs about the fairies, there are other books available. If you want to learn about how it's possible to take a belief in the Tuatha Dé Danann and turn it into a fully realised and worked out religious system, then this is the book for you, I guess. It's only available secondhand. It is out of print. There is a second book which has a red cover, which is about more shamanic practices and not associated with Faery Wicca. And again, it's only available secondhand as well, because it is out of print. I haven't decided yet whether I'll read that, because I honestly did find this book interesting, but it's just I think it's the claim to authoritative, this is the true belief of Ireland. I think that was the thing maybe more I had an issue with than the content of the book itself. But as I say, there are comments that it is highly plagiarised, and that is why it's not currently in print. And if that's the case, obviously that's a fault with the book as well. So maybe this has made you want to read the book, I don't know, or maybe it has saved you the £40 it would cost you to buy it online secondhand, and you can just work with your Faery Wicca tarot without feeling the need to get hold of this book. So I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and well, maybe we can have a wee bit of a chat about it. But I am going to continue to work with and learn more about the Faery Wicca tarot, and I'll be posting more videos about that in due course. But for now, I'll leave it here, and I'll say slán, goodbye. I'll see you again soon.